Hi, my name is Max and I'm the instructor of this course. It's the most comprehensive and honestly best course I ever built. Now, why about JavaScript? JavaScript is one of the most important programming languages you gotta know these days. Now, there are a lot of resources out there that teach you JavaScript, but a lot of them are outdated or not complete. In a lot of them, you start with the old syntax and then switch to the new one. Well, in this course, it was important to me to teach you the most modern form of JavaScript right from the start, without forgetting about the old syntax, which you will also learn so that you're well prepared to dive into any project you want. And it also was super important to me to give you a very comprehensive JavaScript learning experience. In this course, you will learn all about JavaScript. From the very basics, no prior knowledge is required, all the way up to the advanced topics like performance optimization, security, Webpack tooling, browser support, using certain browser APIs, and so on. But we'll start at the basics. Variables, functions. We'll explore the JavaScript specialties like the this keyword. We'll dive into object-oriented programming, into classes, into prototypes. We'll have a look at recursion, callback functions, asynchronous code with promises and async await. We'll have a look at working with the DOM and browser APIs so that you can use JavaScript in the browser and do amazing things there. But we'll also have a look at JavaScript in general. We'll have a module about Node.js because that's also JavaScript. You want to learn that as well. We'll have a lot of modules on advanced topics like browser support and how to ensure that your script runs everywhere. Security, how to optimize performance in JavaScript projects. We'll look behind the scenes of JavaScript engines and understand what's going on there. And we'll do all of that, not just in theory, but with a lot of quizzes, assignments, practical examples and projects so that you really learn JavaScript in the best possible way. This course has more than 40 hours, and not because I wanted to bloat it, but because there is so much content in there. No matter if you're starting and you just go through the course from start to end, or if you already worked with JavaScript or took our JavaScript courses, this course is for you. You can use it as a step-by-step guide or as a reference where you just dive into the different topics you're interested in. I built it such that you can take the course in the way that best suits your needs and that ensures that you get the most out of this course. Now that's the course, but who am I? My name is Maximilian Schwarzmüller. I'm a freelance web developer and 5-star rated instructor here on Udemy. I got many courses on the JavaScript ecosystem on topics that are related to JavaScript, but the big, all-comprising JavaScript course was missing. Now here it is, and I put all my knowledge and experience and the feedback I got from you and fellow students into this course to create the best possible JavaScript learning experience. So I hope you will love this course as much as I loved creating it, and I hope you will get a lot out of it. Now, as with all my courses, in this course you get Q&A support. I do my very best to keep it updated and listen to feedback, maybe add new features, and you got a 30-day money-back guarantee. So there's nothing to lose. You got no risk at all. Have a look at it, see if you like it, and I would love to start this journey together with you. So let's get started with this course and with everything you need to know about JavaScript by diving into this important question. What is JavaScript? Let's have a look at a couple of definitions. JavaScript is a dynamic, weakly typed programming language which is compiled at runtime. It can be executed as part of a web page in a browser or directly on any machine in a so-called host environment. Okay, not entirely clear yet? Let's have a look at an additional definition. JavaScript was created to make web pages more dynamic. That's kind of the idea why JavaScript was invented in the past, you could say. More about the history of JavaScript in a second, by the way. So it was invented to change the content on a page directly from inside the browser. And originally, it was called LiveScript, but due to the popularity of Java back at the time, it was renamed to JavaScript to resemble Java by its name. JavaScript, however, is totally independent from Java. That's important to understand and has nothing in common. It really was just named JavaScript because, well, Java was popular and, people who invented JavaScript wanted JavaScript to be a thing, I guess. But I'm not sure. Are these definitions really clear? Do you now know what JavaScript is? Does dynamic, weakly typed, compiled at runtime make web pages more dynamic? Does this tell you something? Well, let's take a step back maybe. How do web pages work? You are the user visiting a web page, and when you do visit a web page, you use a browser for that. You use your client, your machine, your laptop, your computer, where you have a browser installed on it. You enter a URL or click on a search result on Google, and the web page gets loaded. To be precise, when you initially visit a web page, a request is sent to the server, so to a computer in the internet where that web page, where the HTML file is hosted, and that server then loads that web page and sends it back to your browser in a so-called response. And the most basic form of response we know or we typically see and use when we work with the internet, when we visit a page, is simply an HTML page which is sent back by the server to the client. Now let's say on that loaded web page, let's say it's an online shop, doesn't really matter, the user clicks a button to submit a form. For example, to order some products. Now this will then trigger a new request which is sent by the browser to the server to send this form submission to the server, and the server will handle that incoming request, maybe store some order data in a database, and once it's done, it will reply back with a new response, with a new web page, a new HTML document which is sent back to the client, maybe the order confirmation page. So this is how we interact with the web. This is how web pages traditionally work. Now, JavaScript helps us make this more reactive. It helps us make a web page more reactive and skip that second request response flow in some circumstances to instead change the already loaded page and do something there. Now let's simply see an example which should make this clearer. For that, attached you find a simple project which has 3 folders or 2 folders and 1 file. An assets folder, an info folder, and an index.html file. The extra folders and files you see here are just here in my local setup for version control and for my editor settings. And we can ignore them right now. You don't need them. They're not related to the web page. So we got 3 things in there, 2 folders and the index.html file. Now you can simply double click that index.html file and it will open up here in a new browser window, or it should at least. If not, open a browser window and drag the index.html file into it. Now this is a little dummy page I prepared for you. It holds some dummy information about this course and about me, your instructor. All this information is valid, by the way, but of course we're not building this web page here. Right now this is mostly HTML and CSS, or to be precise, it's pretty much all HTML and CSS at this point. And you can always go back to these files, and in the assets folder you'll find an images folder with my image, you'll find a styles folder with the CSS files, and if you would look into the index.html file, for example by right-clicking on it and opening it with a text editor, and you can use either text edit here on Mac or the normal Notepad or text editor on Windows. If you are using text edit on Mac, go to preferences here, and on open and save, make sure you check this display HTML files as HTML code instead of formatted text box. Then close this and reopen with text edit, and this only applies to Mac here, and you will see the raw HTML code. So this is a bunch of HTML code here, but what you won't see in there is anything JavaScripty in this file. It's just HTML and some imported CSS styles. This leads to this page, and here on this page we have these 2 links, dynamic interpreted and weakly typed. And if you click on any of these links, you're taken to a new page. Here's the dynamic page, where we see a more detailed explanation. And here's the weakly typed page. Now what we have here is a traditional web page, and what we also have here is a new request being sent to a server, if this were served by a server instead of our local file system, and a new page being loaded, right? We're always loading a new page here. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but a more modern way, a more user-friendly way of doing that might be to not load a new page here, but instead to show this piece of information maybe in an overlay to the existing page. Such a modal, as it's called, a little pop-up like window which gets loaded as an overlay on this already existing page. So that we don't need to fetch a new HTML page and break the user experience a bit therefore, but instead that we stay on this existing page and only tweak it a little bit. So we kind of need to tweak the existing HTML code, this code here, which was loaded by the browser, whilst we are on the page. So without loading a new HTML file. That's the idea, and that is where JavaScript can help us and why JavaScript was invented and why it is so important these days. Because any modern website you visit, all these exciting user interactions you have there with drop-downs, with overlays, and so on, all of that is driven by JavaScript. And we can turn this page here into a more exciting page as well. I prepared something for you. You might have noticed that in this starting code I provided to you, in the assets folder, you also have a scripts folder with an app.js file. .js stands for JavaScript, and this is how you store JavaScript code in JavaScript. Now we can of course also inspect that file by clicking on Open With, and then also text edit. And what you see in there is JavaScript code. Now at this point of time, of course, you won't understand all this code. Maybe you understand none of that if you have no previous experience with JavaScript, and will of course change that throughout the course. We'll start at the core basics, and you will understand all this code once we progress throughout the course, and of course once we completed the course. But for now, we can just take this code for granted, close this file, and ignore it. And instead, let's go back to our index.html file, to the source code we opened here in the editor. And below this link here, where we import the app CSS file, above the head here, let's add a new HTML tag. Script, also a closing tag for it. And then add a src attribute to script here, and point at assets/scripts/app.js. So at this JavaScript file we just had a look at. That alone won't do the trick. Let's also scroll down a bit and go to these two links we have here, to the dynamic interpreted and the weakly typed link. Now there, let's remove that link to info dynamic HTML and add a hash instead, and instead add a new attribute here, data-text, to this anchor tag here, equals, and then double quotes. And now let's go to the info folder and then to the dynamic HTML file, open that with the text editor, and simply grab the text you have in there between the paragraph tags, excluding the paragraph tags, and copy that and paste that here between the double quotes. Now make sure you get rid of any line breaks you might have in there, because that will not work, so that this is all one long line of code in the end. And thereafter add one more thing to the anchor tag, class, to add a CSS class, info-modal. Now repeat that. We can copy all of these attributes on the second link and replace its reference with the hashtag reference as well. And the text we show there should of course now be the text we find in the weakly typed HTML file. So if we open that with the text editor, let's grab this text here we find in there, copy it, and also replace the text here on the second anchor tag with this text. Now, again, make sure you get rid of any line breaks you might have here, because these will break your code. Now with that, let's go back up to our script import and add one important word here after the src attribute, and that's the defer attribute. This controls how and when this JavaScript code is executed, and I'll dive back into this a little bit later. For now, let's just add it, then save this whole index.html file, go back to your page and reload it by simply clicking the reload icon here, and then click on one of these links. And now you will get this nice overlay here, which you can also close by clicking on that backdrop. Now what we have here is new content, which is dynamically added to this existing web page by JavaScript. We're not loading a new web page here. Instead, this overlay is shown by JavaScript. And this, of course, is a way better user experience because now we don't send the user off to a new page. We don't wait for new HTML code to be downloaded. We change the existing page. And this is something you see on a lot of modern web pages because it's faster. It's more like in a mobile app where you also don't have to wait for things to complete. And therefore, this is one of the core reasons why JavaScript is that important. It allows us to make web pages more dynamic. So if we come back to that question of what JavaScript is, if I quickly dive into the core things we learned on this previous slide, JavaScript is a dynamic, weakly typed programming language. It's an interpreted language, which means it's compiled on the fly. It's compiled before it runs and not compiled during development as some other programming languages are. It's a hosted language that runs in different environments, though thus far in the last example we just saw it run in the browser, but I'll come back to other environments in this course as well. And the most prominent use case is the case we just saw. We run code in a browser on a web page to make that more dynamic. So now we understand why we use JavaScript and what it allows us to do. But what do these terms, dynamic, weakly typed, and interpreted, as well as hosted language, mean in detail? Let's have a look at this interpreted, on-the-fly compiled thing. How is the JavaScript code in our browser executed? And not just in our browser, but typically in any environment where you run JavaScript. Let's say you write your JavaScript code and you want it to have some effect on the web page if we talk about the browser as the environment where we run our script. Then you have one important thing built into any environment where you want to run JavaScript code, and that's a JavaScript engine. It's built into the browser, as I said. There in Chrome, for example, in the Chrome browser, it's V8, that's the name of the engine. In Firefox, the name would be SpiderMonkey. And of course, other browsers also either reuse these engines or have their own engines. Now, the job of the engine is to parse code, so parse, read, and understand your JavaScript code. Then, on the fly, compile it to machine code, because machine code executes faster. So it reads your code, but it does not necessarily execute it like that, but instead it now takes that code and compiles it to code, which is faster to execute by the machine, and then it executes that machine code. This all happens in the browser with the help of the JavaScript engine. And then when that code is executed, we have that effect on our web page. Now, important modern engines have a lot of optimizations there. They might start executing your uncompiled code and then compile the code whilst they're also already executing it to get started executing faster and then switch to the compiled code dynamically and so on. So we have a lot of optimizations going on here, and we will dig a bit deeper into what the JavaScript engine is exactly in a separate module in the course. For now, this is all we need to know. The browser has a built-in tool that takes our code, compiles it, optimizes it, and executes it. And also a bit more technical side note, all of that happens on a single thread. Now, this is very technical, but you might know that in a computer, you have certain tasks that are executed. For example, the browser you opened is a task, or actually it might consist of multiple different tasks that are executed together. The JavaScript code is also yet another task which your operating system in the end has to take care of. And this runs on a single thread. Of course, we have multi-threading on modern machines so that they can do multiple tasks at the same time, but the JavaScript code execution runs on one single thread there. So the JavaScript code execution always happens in one single thread on your operating system. Right now, this doesn't really matter. It will become more important later in the course, though, when I will come back to this concept of single threading and which implications this has for JavaScript. But with that, we know what interpreted means, what compilation means, and how the JavaScript code is executed. What does dynamic and weakly typed mean then? JavaScript is a dynamic, interpreted programming language, but it's also a weakly typed programming language. Now, what does this mean? For one, the dynamic interpreted part, as you learned, means that it's not pre-compiled. Other languages, like C++, are compiled during or after development. So before you share them with the end users, JavaScript is on the fly compiled. And that means that the code is evaluated and executed at runtime. It also means that the code can change at runtime. Now, of course, not the code you wrote, it won't magically change. Of course, the code you wrote gets executed. But in that code, you can do some things which you're not allowed to do in other programming languages. For example, if you're working with a variable, something we will only learn in the second module, for now you can just keep in mind that a variable is a data container, you might store, let's say, some text in there. Text you need in your script to, for example, output it to the user. In JavaScript, you are allowed to dynamically switch the type of data there. In a variable, you might start by storing some text, and suddenly at a later point of time, you store a number in there instead, in the same variable. Now again, we haven't really learned about variables yet. We will, of course, do that. But the one thing you can simply keep in mind is that the dynamic thing in JavaScript means that it is parsed and interpreted and compiled at runtime, and that therefore it is able to do certain things. For example, switching the data of a variable other programming languages are not allowed to do. Now, it's not necessarily good to switch the type of data dynamically or unexpectedly, but you can do that. The main takeaway, however, is the on-the-fly compilation and interpretation. Now, what about the weakly typed part here? This means that when we work with data in JavaScript, for example, text data or numbers, you don't have to tell JavaScript that you're going to work with a text now or you're going to work with a number now. Instead, data types are assumed, are inferred automatically, so to say. That's also related to this dynamic nature where data types can also change from one line to another. Now, this might sound strange, but in other programming languages, you have to define the type of data a variable will hold in advance. In JavaScript, that's not the case. You don't have to tell JavaScript that this variable, this data container, will hold a number. Instead, you store a data in there, and if that happens to be a number, so it is. In other programming languages, you have to tell the language that you're going to store a number in there, and if you store something else, you would get an error. That's not the case in JavaScript. It's forgiving there because it's dynamic, and it also doesn't care about strong type definitions in advance. Instead, you just store data in there and go with whatever type of data that holds. So data types are not set in stone, but can change. Now, this is arguably a bit more advanced. I just want you to be aware of these terms, dynamic and weakly typed right now, and they will make more and more sense as we progress throughout this course and work with data and variables. For now, just be aware of these terms. Now, the last thing we saw on the previous definition slide is that JavaScript runs on a host environment. So that means a JavaScript engine can be part or can be executed in different environments. The most well-known environment is the browser. Modern browsers have JavaScript engines built in, and they're therefore capable of executing JavaScript code. But you also can run JavaScript in other environments, for example, on the server side. So right on a computer without having a browser in between. So not inside of a browser, but simply execute code like this on your machine. Now, JavaScript was invented to run in the browser to make websites more dynamic, to be able to change things on a website without loading a new page, you could say. Because JavaScript is able to closely work together with the loaded HTML code, with CSS. You can also use JavaScript to send background HTTP requests, so to send some behind-the-scenes requests and fetch data without reloading the page, and much, much more. And we'll do all of that throughout the course. Now, there also are certain things JavaScript can't do when it runs in the browser environment, though. For example, it can't access your local file system for security reasons, because otherwise every web page you visit would be able to read your file system, maybe delete files on your computer, and so on, which would be horrible, of course. And in general, it is running in a sandbox, you can say. It's not able to interact with your operating system and so on. The browser gives you certain things you can do in this environment and doesn't allow other things. Now, as I said, the browser is only one environment though, the one for which JavaScript was invented, but not the only one we're restricted to right now. Instead, the JavaScript engine Google developed, V8 is the name of the engine, was extracted by some people to run JavaScript anywhere. Because the idea was, well, if we have the engine in the browser, why don't we take it out of the browser and then make it available as a standalone tool which you can use to execute JavaScript anywhere else, directly on your machine. And this tool is in the end called Node.js. Now in this course, I'll have a separate module about Node.js where I show you how that works and how it uses the same JavaScript syntax you learned throughout the course, but which new features it brings to the table. For the majority of the course, however, we'll focus on the browser side because this is the side where you absolutely need JavaScript, and it's also the side where you're able to see more because you have a web page where things change and so on. Now back to Node.js though for a second. Node.js can be executed on any machine, and therefore it's also often used to build web backends, to build web servers. Server-side JavaScript is also something you often hear as a description for that. Now, you might know about server-side languages like PHP or also Java and other languages as well. Well, JavaScript with Node.js can also be used to run it on the backend of a web page, so on the server and not on the client in the browser of your users. Now, Node.js also has certain things it can do and can't do. Since it runs directly on a machine, in Node.js you're able to access the local file system, so you are able to write files and so on, because unlike browser-side JavaScript, Node.js code has to be executed actively by you. It's not like you visit a web page and then this starts happening. Instead, it can only access the file system on the machine where it executes, which, for example, is the server where it runs, not your machine. And it's also able to interact with the operating system and so on. However, on the other hand, since it doesn't have direct access to the loaded web page, it can't manipulate HTML or CSS like browser-side JavaScript is able to do. So we basically have inverse access capabilities here. And these are the different environments where JavaScript is able to run. Now in this course, we'll focus on the browser side because the JavaScript syntax you learn will be the same no matter in which environment you run JavaScript code. But in the browser, we simply have more visual feedback and can see what happens. Nonetheless, as I said, we have this separate Node.js module later in the course where I'll also dive into the different things we can do in Node.js and how that works.